Welcome to the Lessons for Luca podcast. I'm your host, Michael De Santi, author of New Man Emerging, transformational trainer and coach, and most importantly, I'm Luca's dad. On this podcast, we have the discovery and the exploration of what it means to be a good man and what it means to live a good life. In the last few episodes, I've been talking about what I call the four fundamentals of a good man: presence, priority, philosophy, and purpose. And so this is the third installation of this series. I want to talk about today what it means to develop and to cultivate and generate a personal philosophy. I've loved philosophy for most of my life. And one of the things I love about philosophy is actually the breakdown of the word, philosophia. And the origin of that is love of wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And when we develop and cultivate a personal philosophy, really what we're doing is we're creating a connection to our own inner wisdom. We're creating a relationship with our inner wisdom. We're deepening that inner wisdom. And so by developing this third fundamental of being a good man, we're living by our own personal philosophy. And to live by our own personal philosophy, we're really self-imposing guardrails around what we value physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so by living by this philosophy, what we're really doing is we're constantly bringing to the forefront of our consciousness and to our habits, our actions, our behaviors, and our choices, we're bringing to the forefront what we value. What do I genuinely value in my life? What do I genuinely value as a man? What do I genuinely value in my relationships and in my deeper purpose in life? By living with and from a personal philosophy, I'm always keeping my values at the forefront of all that I do. I keep it at the forefront of my consciousness in the big things and in the little things. And so when we live by a personal philosophy, we develop what I call a code. And we live by a code. And that code, like I said, is self-imposed. That code is, I'll go deeper into this, but living by a code, again, keeps my values at the forefront of my consciousness. When a man doesn't live by a code, he becomes susceptible to life's ever-changing weather and events. That man will become easily distractible, easily seduced, and worst case, corruptible. And so when we don't live by a code, we become susceptible to life's ever-changing weather. Life's weather is always going to change. It's always going to blindside us. It's always going to be unpredictable. And if we're not grounded and established in the code that we live by, in our own personal philosophy, we'll always be moved to and fro. If we have no personal philosophy, no value, conscious value that we bring to our life and to our future, we'll constantly default back to old reactivity, old operating systems, old patterns. And if we don't have a code, if we don't live by a personal philosophy, then life becomes a lot about immediacy. And it strengthens our system of scarcity because it's always, what can I get now? How do I feel now? What's my mood now? Reactivity. What can I get now? And forget about my values or forget about the future that I want to generate. Forget about, we'll live by like the ends justify the means. And we won't realize that we're actually deteriorating part of our own inner wisdom, because we're constantly thrown to this system of reactivity and system of scarcity because everything will be about now. And again, life's job is to constantly throw weather at us, to constantly challenge us to that greater sense of self, that greater version of who we are. And so our philosophy and the code that we live by are really the guardrails and the rules that we operate within. And they're self-imposed. They're not given to me by anyone else. They're established within me and then demonstrated through me. Having a code and a personal philosophy, it makes our values what we value. That I'm actually saying that operating from my values, I make my value and my philosophy and my code, I make that immovable. I let life do what life is going to do. I let life and its weather dance around me, but I stay grounded in my personal philosophy. I stay grounded in the code that I live by. And life is going to continue to throw me pain and loss and adversity and uncertainty. But with a code, I could go into that unknown future and I could have and establish a sense of self and bring that sense of self with me. And that changes the game. It changes the game, and it changes my relationship with the unknown and my relationship with the future. Because I'm making sure and prioritizing that when I walk into that unknown future, I bring what I value most with me. And it keeps us from being, like I said, distractible, seduced, and corruptible. And our code, there's what I call 4 quadrants of our code. There's our principles, there's our virtues, our rules, and our non-negotiables. And before I break down all 4 of those and distinguish them, I want to make an important distinction, especially in transformation, that's incredibly valuable because it starts to decipher the way we're doing things. And so this distinction is the difference in the distinction between ways of doing and ways of being. Generally, our culture over-focuses on ways of doing. It's a default for us to, anytime there's a challenge, it's what do I do? What's the strategy? What are the boxes I need to check? What's the system I need to learn? And so we are kind of thrown almost automatically or reactively into what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And so a lot of our life becomes very reactive in our doing. I need to figure this out. I need to do this better or faster or stronger. And we double down on our ways of doing. It's not that ways of doing aren't important. I just think that we overemphasize and overfocus on them. Distinct from ways of doing are ways of being. Ways of being are the internal states that we value, that we choose, and that we make commitments to. And ways of being are really the spirit in which we do things. So the ways of being, by over-focusing on ways of being, we can actually start to understand and recognize that the way I'm being influences my way of doing. So as an example of that, if I have a checklist of all of these things to do, all of these ways of doing, all of these strategies and skill sets that I need to do and do and do, I could have all that, but I could be checking all those boxes off in a state of frustration, a state of impatience, a state of resistance, a state of victimhood. And I'll always be confused about, like, I don't understand. I'm doing all the right things. I'm checking off all the right boxes, but why isn't it producing either the result that I want or the state that I want? And so when we shift to valuing my way of being, I could say that list may not change, but I can consciously choose and commit and interject that I'm going to do that list. I'm going to do all those priorities, but from a way of being that's patient or kind or compassionate, open, a way of being with empathy or with understanding, with trust or with confidence. Ways of being are internal states, but we forget that we can choose our way of being no matter what. And by over-focusing on ways of doing, we are convinced and conditioned that if I just do all these things, it'll generate peace and acceptance and confidence and esteem. And I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm saying that ways of being generate and put spirit to the ways that I do things. If I'm going to take my wife on a date, technically, and I technically checked off that box, but if I'm on that date and I'm distracted or I'm checked out or I'm not paying attention, I'm not present, I'm still technically doing or checking that box off, but my state or way of being is out of alignment. It's incongruent. And so by understanding and consciously remembering that I can choose my state of being, then from that state of being, whatever I do, it's already going to be injected or influenced by my state of being. So that's a really important distinction to make, especially in transformation, because our conditioning is so reversed of that. Once I check all these boxes, I'll experience this state. And I'm saying, you know what? First, choose your state and then inject that into what you do. The reason I bring that up and I distinguish that is because the first quadrant of the code that we live by are our principles. And principles are the ways of being that we value most and that we make commitments to. So when we think of principles as ways of being, you're looking at things like authenticity, forgiveness, confidence, power, forgiveness, gratitude, reverence, humility, patience. These are all ways of being. And by establishing them as principles, what we're really saying is these are the ways of being that I value most in my life, in my character, in my relationships. I'm actually highlighting them and saying that my life would almost feel incomplete without these characteristics, these ways of being, these principles that I establish my life by. So principles are those ways of being that we value the most. And then we make commitments to them. We make commitments to patience, to understanding, to connection, to vulnerability, to openness, to gratitude and forgiveness. We establish that they're values in our life, and then we make commitments to them. We generate forward with them. We highlight them in the forefront of our consciousness and in our actions. We inject what we do with these ways of being and with these principles. And so principles like forgiveness and humility, these are so important to me that I make sure that they're highlighted in everything that I do. And so I want to make sure that these are at the forefront of the code that I live by, because these characteristics shape what I do. And also, if what I do doesn't have these principles injected into them, then my actions will actually be fruitless. I may even accomplish everything on my list of priority. I may accomplish everything that I've set out to do. But if I've done all of that without what I value internally the most, it'll always feel empty or lost or fruitless. So the first quadrant of the code that we live by are our principles. We must establish those principles, highlight them as the inner values or the inner states of our life, and then make sure that they are constantly at the forefront of our actions, our habits, our choices, our decisions, our behaviors, and our relationships. The next quadrant of the code that we live by are our virtues. And principles and virtues are actually very connected. Virtues are the habits, the behaviors, the actions, and the choices that strengthen my principles. So principles may be vague or ethereal, but virtues are actually tangible. By establishing virtue, I'm actually saying that by doing this or refraining from doing this, I directly link and connect and know that it will strengthen the principles that I live my life by. So certain virtues that I say I do or I refrain from doing, I know that there's a direct connection that when I do them, I strengthen what I value. And when I don't do them, I know that I weaken what I value. So as an example, part of the code that I live by, I have a principle of humility. And so therefore my virtue of humility is I don't brag or I don't boast. So I understand that whatever I accomplish, if I find myself bragging or boasting, I know that I'm weakening my principle of humility. And so when I have this principle of humility, I know when I accomplish something that, listen, I don't need to brag about it. I don't need to boast about it. I know that I'm strengthening that principle of humility. As another example, I have a principle of forgiveness. And therefore, as a virtue, I don't hold grudges. I'm quick to let things go. I won't hold on to something and keep someone trapped in some level of injustice. I'm quick to forgive and I don't hold grudges. And I understand that when I do that, I'm strengthening that principle, that value of forgiveness for me. And so I want to have a direct relationship and correlation between those two things because they make up two really important quadrants of the code that I live by. I have a principle of reverence. And so as a virtue to strengthen that principle of reverence, I spend at least an hour outside every day undistracted, without a phone, not answering emails or making calls. Like I spend time really like revering nature and the natural world. It's a virtue of mine. And I also know that virtue strengthens the principle of reverence. I'll give you one more example, is I have a principle of gratitude. And my virtue, remember, it's a habit, a behavior, an action, a choice. So my virtue is I don't complain. I understand and I know and I directly link that when I complain, it'll weaken my principle of gratitude. And so by not complaining, I'm strengthening this virtue muscle that actually has me tap into a level of gratitude, even for the challenge, a level of creativity to overcome that challenge. It helps me avoid victimhood and pity because I've said that this is my virtue. And by living by that virtue, I know that maybe not even immediately, but over time, it'll continue to strengthen that principle of gratitude for me. And so those are two really important quadrants of the code that we live by because they're actually directly connected. They feed each other. The third quadrant of the code that we live by are our rules. Rules are predetermined choices, actions, habits, and behaviors that I pre-establish for future scenarios or circumstances. And so if you think about every game that we play has rules to it. Without rules, games would be chaotic. Rules really establish sidelines and guardrails and allow me to see where I'm positioned, where my posture is, if I'm going outside of those rules or those guardrails or those guidelines and sidelines. And they help me establish that when life delivers me certain scenarios, I've already pre-chosen the way I'm going to respond to that scenario. That's one of the biggest distinctions about rules. Again, they're predetermined choices, actions, habits, and behaviors and decisions for future scenarios or circumstances. So I'm ultimately saying that these scenarios may not show up every day, but when they show up, this is how I'll act. I've already made my choice. I've made my choice now for some potential future scenario. Simple rules. So rules could be small or they could be really large. And if you think about, like I said, like we have rules for all of the games we play, and yet a lot of us don't have rules for life. We don't have rules for the financial games that we're playing. We don't have rules for our marriage. We don't have rules for our health or our physical well-being. We establish rules not as punishment, but as sidelines and guardrails. So simple rules that I have are I never shake a man's hand sitting down. I never shake a man's hand or a woman's hand while I'm sitting down. I always stand up. I always look them in the eye, and then I'll shake their hand. It's simple. It's nothing monumental, but it's a simple rule that I live my life by. It doesn't happen every day, but when it happens, I have already predetermined this is my choice in action. I stand up. Certain rules in my financial well-being is I'll never have a single point of failure in my investments, meaning I'll never make an investment that's so risky that if it failed, it would put my family or our future investments in harm. I will never be over leveraged in a particular financial position. So here's the goal of that, as we frame it as a rule, is if an opportunity comes to me from a business perspective, a financial perspective, and I find that I'm overstepping my own personal rule, and it's over leveraging and putting my family at risk, the answer is an automatic no. So I have no single point of failure in my financial game. Other simple rules: I never litter. I have a principle of gratitude and of reverence, so therefore I don't litter. I never, if I have the opportunity to just throw something on the ground, I won't do it. It's a simple rule that I live by. Another rule is I don't drink soda, I don't eat processed sugars, and I don't eat fast food. It's a rule that I have around my physical health and well-being. So if the opportunity or scenario or situation is presented to me, that's a rule of mine. I've already predetermined that choice, action, habit, or behavior. Another simple rule that I live my life by is I never leave the house without saying I love you. I always let my wife or our son know I love you. If I'm going out of the house for X amount of time, I'll always say that I love you. It's just a rule that I live my life by. Again, it doesn't have to be major or massive. It's just a simple rule that keeps what I value at the forefront of my consciousness. So rules are predetermined choices, actions, habits, and behaviors for future scenarios and circumstances. When we live by rules, it actually takes up a lot less mental bandwidth, because I don't need to show up to future scenarios and then overthink, what am I going to do here? I've already pre-chosen it. That door's already closed. One other simple rule around health that I have is I never consume alcohol during the week. So if someone offers me alcohol on a Tuesday night, I already know the answer is no. If they ask me over and over again, they're already going to know that the answer is no, so they'll just simply stop asking me. It's not a matter of, let me see how I feel. What's my craving? I don't know. Would that go well with what I'm eating? That choice and that overthinking is already gone. It's eliminated. Just simple rules that I live my life by. So what are those rules that you live your life by? Are they established? Are you just going on a whim? Are you wondering why, when scenarios show up, why they're chaotic for you? A good indicator is I may not have rules established for those scenarios. That's the third quadrant of living by a code. And the fourth quadrant are what I call my non-negotiables. Non-negotiables are the daily and weekly self-generated actions, habits, and behaviors and choices that I commit to regardless of scenarios and circumstances. So non-negotiables, I really make the immovable parts of my day or of my week. So remember, they're daily or weekly self-generated actions, habits, choices, decisions, and behaviors that I commit to regardless of circumstances or scenarios. So non-negotiables become those immovable things that every day I make sure I generate them. Every week I make sure that I generate them. And what that does is it keeps, again, those values at the forefront of my consciousness, but on a micro level of daily or weekly patterns. So certain non-negotiables for me are every day, the first thing I do when I wake up is say thank you. I have conditioned myself that that's the first thought on my mind and the first words on my lips every morning. It's non-negotiable for me. It doesn't matter what mood I'm in. It doesn't matter about the night before. That is the first thing that I do every morning when I wake up. The first thing I say is thank you. It's non-negotiable. Other non-negotiables for me are around my health. Every morning I have a certain protocol that I address right away. It's the first thing that I do. I establish my health protocol and I execute on it. It's non-negotiable, whether I'm traveling, whether I feel like it or not. That's not the question at all. It's immovable for me. It's non-negotiable. Also, another non-negotiable for me is I always start my day collecting with my family. We spend even a small amount of quality time just simply collecting. I collect with my wife and my son and our dog. And before I go into the day of emails or responding to people or looking at my to-do list, I'll always make sure that I collect with my family before I go into my business life. It's critical for me. It's non-negotiable for me. Another non-negotiable for me is every day, no matter what, at least once a day, I tell my wife I love her. Whether I text her or whether I'm not traveling and I'm home, at least once a day, I will let my wife know I love you. It's non-negotiable. It doesn't matter the mood that I'm in. It doesn't matter if we got into something the night before. It's non-negotiable for me. Another non-negotiable for me is I always, before I eat, I always close my eyes and say thank you and say a quick prayer of gratitude. It's non-negotiable, right? It's immovable. It's a process that I've conditioned myself for that I do regardless of how I feel, regardless of the situation or the scenario. Another non-negotiable for me is I make sure that I exercise no less than 4 days every week. So the other non-negotiables I gave you were more on the daily. This non-negotiable is more of a broader weekly perspective. Another non-negotiable for me is every other week I buy my wife flowers. It's non-negotiable, and it's not every day. It's a broader timeline and perspective that it's every other week, but it's immovable. I just simply build it into my daily or my weekly routines. Those are our non-negotiables. They're self-generated. They're self-generated based on what I value. Those are self-generated based on what I value. So at the core of our code is the philosophy of what I value most in life. And by establishing principles, establishing virtues, establishing rules that I live my life by and that I operate my future by establishing those daily and weekly non-negotiables, I'm putting my inner wisdom and my inner value at the forefront of all that I do. I inject that into my business relationships. I inject that into my business endeavors. I inject that into my physical health. I inject that into my marriage. I inject that into all my relationships. I inject that into how I treat myself and others, what I say yes to, what I say no to. Remember, when a man doesn't live by a code, he becomes susceptible to life's ever-changing weather and becomes distractible and seducible and corruptible. But when that code of value is established at the forefront of all that we do, we operate a life and a future that is constantly and consistently highlighting our own inner value and our own inner wisdom. And one of the most important points that I can make here is that I said earlier that living by a code makes our values what we value. And the beauty behind that is that the principles and the virtues and the rules and the non-negotiables, the code that we live by, that's our reward. That to live from a place of generosity and care and integrity and honesty and authenticity and confidence and power, that is the reward of life. The moment I start to use my code or my principles as a strategy to get things that I want or accomplishments or status, that is no longer the reward. That is now a sense of manipulation. And we cannot fool ourselves in the long term, and we cannot fool life. But when generosity and authenticity and our principles become what we value, it creates a sense of self that becomes unshakable. And that's critical. There's a part of Stoicism that says, forget about the third thing. And what that means is if I, from a place of sincerity, live a principled life, And by living a principled life, that makes a positive impact on others or on something else. My principled life is thing number one. The impact is thing number two. Thing number three is, well, I want accolade for it. I want a thank you for it. I want a status for it. And a lot of us tend to over-focus on the third thing, which is, yeah, I was being generous and I think you took advantage of it. You didn't give me the proper thank you that I wanted. What I'm saying here is your principles, your code, your virtues, your rules, those are the reward. Your authenticity is the reward. Your ability to be generous is the reward. Your ability to be forgiving and live from a place of value, that is the reward. Don't worry about the third thing. Be very clear that this is what you value and that value makes an impact on others. Let life handle the rest. Let the trajectory of the future handle and let it be and handle and land where it needs to land. Don't worry about the third thing. You just keep doubling down on the value that you generate within yourself and your own inner wisdom. That's what it means to live by a code. The final thing I'll say here is a few episodes ago, I was talking about the four inevitabilities of life: pain, loss, uncertainty, and adversity. Recently, I was having a conversation with my wife. We were talking about our upcoming anniversary, and my wife said something really profound to me, and I don't know if she realized how potent it was or how it landed for me at the time. But what my wife said, we were talking about our history, our personal history, our history together. And what my wife said, she said, what I appreciate about our marriage is that we've been through hard times, but we've never been through bad times. And I thought that was incredibly profound. And really what that means to me is that when we live by a code, when we live by our own personal philosophy, it doesn't exempt us from hard times, but it will help us avoid bad times. If at the forefront of our marriages and our business endeavors and our health, our financial states, our fatherhood, if at the forefront of that is the philosophy of what we value, and that's what we inject into everything we do and the way that we do it, doesn't mean we're exempt from hard times, but it will lessen and help us avoid the bad times. Bad times are self-inflicted. They're self-inflicted because we live chaotically, because we don't understand the rules that we're living our life by. We're ignoring our non-negotiables. We are downplaying our principles, and we're unconscious to the virtues that we live by. And when those become the forefront of our consciousness, the outcomes of it are almost secondary to the states that they generate within us. At the end of the day, I can only close my own eyes. No one can close my own eyes for me. And I want to make sure that I close my eyes knowing that I lived from a place of personal philosophy today, that I generated what I generated from a place of principle, of virtue. I established my rules and my non-negotiables, and I lived by them on the micro level and on the macro level, on the daily basis and in a future basis. And so that's the value and the reward of living by a code. It's the third fundamental of being a good man. We must establish a personal philosophy and live from that place and generate from that place over and over and over again on the micro level and on the macro level, personally and then also interpersonally in our relationships. So next episode, we'll go into the fourth fundamental of being a good man, which is to live from a deeper place of purpose. Again, as always, thank you so much for being on this journey with me. Until we meet again, be a good man, live a good life, and determine each of those for yourself.